Hello, so this is going to be the first of two Hume videos. This reading is an interesting experiment for you guys at this point in the semester, because I hope it should be fairly obvious that Hume thinks that whatever the classical metaphysics that we've been studying, whatever it is, he's not even sure. He's very intent on demolishing a lot of the basic principles that we have seen claimed in our Aristotle and Aquinas readings. Um, Hume is a skeptic. He is joining a long tradition of different kinds of thinkers who are attracted to trying to claim that what we can actually know about the world, about ourselves, about our thought processes, even our understandings of basic categories such as mathematics, triangles, lines, and even something like the basic idea that fire causes heat, this basic idea of cause and effect, just simply aren't real because we can't trust our impressions of these things. We can't reason from what we see to some kind of idea of cause and effect. So skepticism is probably helpful for you to think of not so much as a as a as a historical moment, but rather sort of a human temptation that's always present, really within any given period of history. Um, we There are plenty of Greek skeptics, ancient Greek skeptics, who were working at the same time as Aristotle, and skepticism is something that doesn't ever really go away, and it's actually a good thing that we have access to it. Hume is famous for having inspired Immanuel Kant. He says he read Hume claiming that you can't really understand what cause and effect is um, in an intellectual way. And he says reading this, even though he disagreed with it, woke him from his dogmatic slumber. So he was being sort of lazy about what he believed to be true because he was basing it on dogmatism, um, taking something to be true just because an authority says it so, rather than having a real understanding of yourself about why you think it would be correct or not. So skepticism is helpful because even though I personally, as a good Aristotelian, would disagree with basically everything, well, a lot of what Hume is saying, it's really helpful to read someone who thinks that there's no form, that form is a meaningless concept. And it's really helpful to question our ideas of like, just what are we getting from our basic experience of the world. Think of it as good medicine. Um, Sometimes medicine tastes nasty, but it helps you. It helps, it opens the possibility that you could really know what you really think to be true. If you still want to hold out for some kind of causality in the world, which is important because we base a lot of our basic actions on this, moral, ethical, political, and scientific. Um, you can take this as a moment to allow yourself to fully doubt so that you can come out on the other side and have a stronger sense, a stronger ability of to argue about if these metaphysical principles do have some reality beyond simply the authority of the people that we've been reading. So Hume is writing this first part of the Treatise of Human Nature around 1738. That's when it's published. He is a Scotsman. He's part of the Scottish Enlightenment, so very much like removed from some of the things that are happening, even just in London or on the continent in France and Germany. I always think of him as just very, very far away, and yet he's part of the same, a lot of the same intellectual movements that are happening at the time, just in his own sort of peculiar way. I think it will be helpful as you read and try to think about this and write your reflection for Sunday. Um, Hume's trying to come up with a reductive way of explaining how human beings reason. Um, and so you want to ask yourself, are these descriptions of what cause and effect really is? It's just a custom or a habit or an association, um, substance or form. It's just a conjunction of different ideas. It doesn't have any real wholeness to it. You want to think, okay, that's his theory about what we're really experiencing when I start to think about like my experience of a table, a cup, a chair, a human being. So are his explanations enough to explain my experience? He is saying that if you really, really focus on precisely what you see and hear and touch and taste, you'll have to agree with his theory. Um, I would claim that our experience is richer than that, and so he's being sort of unhelpfully reductive. But that's the question for you. Is this enough? Do we need a stronger metaphysics? Do we need more reality to our idea of substance, our idea of cause, or not? So it's something to ask yourself as you write. Um, so as you can see, he's dealing with a lot of the same concepts that we've been talking about. He's just trying to come up with a completely different explanation of them. So the first most important aspect of what he's writing about is where he starts right at the beginning in part one, section one of the first volume, the origin of our ideas. His everything comes back to this basic principle for him that there are two kinds of things in our minds, impressions and ideas. Impressions are like the sensory data that we get, and ideas are something like the language, or the words, or the sort of intellectual, roughly speaking, way that we think about them. He says, perceptions which enter with force and violence we call impressions. This also describes our sensations, our passions, our emotions, when they first make their appearance in the soul. Whereas by ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. So an impression would be, I don't know, my lamp right here. It strikes me with a violence that I see the light here. And then my idea of light would simply be a very faint and kind of old version of my original impression of light. And it would be put together by means of all the different impressions of light that I have run across in my experience. And if my experience is limited, then my idea of light is just going to be not that great. I'm going to need a lot more experiences of artificial light, sunlight in spring, sunlight as the sun's setting, as it's rising, different hemisphere would help. All of these things sort of would make my idea of light richer. So he'd be claiming that there's no way that I can access what light is simply from one perception of it, or what he wants to call an impression. So he takes this basic distinction and builds everything that follows from it. He is going to claim that all ideas are simply a bundle of impressions. Ideas don't have any independent reality from impressions, and they don't, there's no way to have a sort of clear, intellectual, unified understanding of anything that isn't just sort of a mishmash of our initial impressions. He says our memories are faint impressions. Our imagination takes our memories of things and mixes them around. Some ideas are simple, some are complex. Things like light are simple. A color is simple, a taste is simple. A specific smell is simple. But my imagination takes these faint impressions preserved in my memory and mixes them all around to make slightly more complex ideas. He talks about seeing Paris. You know, he's a Scotsman. He's like, "Oh, I've been to Paris. I'm sophisticated." He's seen Paris, but shall I affirm I can form such an idea of that city as will perfectly represent all its streets and houses in their real and just proportions. So especially like if I could really understand Paris, I would almost sort of have a map of it in my mind, like a perfect sense impression of the entire thing. That in itself is sort of fishy. You think about this with respect to New York, big complicated city. What would it mean to know New York? Does New York have an essence, a substance, a form? It certainly wouldn't just be a map, you would say. All right. So once he's laid down the basic difference between impression and idea, then he starts in about section 4, starting to talk about these three qualities, or sort of general associating qualities of the mind, that the mind sort of associates together to form from all of its impressions that sort of loosely join ideas almost by chance. Resemblance, contiguity in time and place, and cause and effect. And this is just at the very beginning of section 4. Um, so the most important here is cause and effect. But what he builds what cause and effect is out of resemblance and contiguity in time and place. So if you think about what resemblance would be first, he says resemblance is the most important. Anything can be, almost any existing thing has some kind of relation to something else. It does have some relation to something else. Um, and so almost any one thing in the world could resemble something else, even if it's just like, well, they resemble each other because they're existing. Or if they don't exist, they resemble each other backwards. Like I'm using the idea of existence to say, well, that thing doesn't exist. Trying to think of a good example. This would be something that would be good to just to talk about when I talk to you guys on Zoom tomorrow live. But you think about it like, I'll look at the image here. I see colors in front of me. I see lines. I see some shapes that are rectangular. The lines seem to mimic each other, if only because they're lines. So we're in this very messy world where even things that look to be opposite, like hot and cold, black and white, they really resemble each other more than they don't. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much trouble thinking, because he says you look at something and immediately there's almost too many things that are like it for you to really think clearly about just what belongs to it and what doesn't. So first you have resemblance, just basic, something is a little bit like something else in any respect at all. And then you have contiguity. He says, one of the most important aspects of our perception is that we just often see two things sitting next to each other. So like I see physically with my eyes and my sense of touch that these two things are next to each other. And it's this basic, like, impression of seeing two things together that allows my mind to, by habit or by analogy, just kind of say like, oh yeah, this thing is next to that. They must have some kind of stronger connection or relationship to each other than if they were like very far apart. All this is sort of like oversimplistic and it bothers me as a good Aristotelian, but that's what he says. So, okay. So whenever I see, I'm constantly using my intelligence to think about what resembles each other, what things resemble each other, and then what things lie next to each other. And from those two very basic ideas, I come up with the idea of cause and effect. When I see, a pen sitting next to like something that's written in ink, like something that's handwritten, I just physically see the pen next to the thing that's written, and I associate pen as the cause of things written in ink because I physically see them next to each other. The pen, he says, we can't claim that the pen causes the writing, but my mind makes a kind of a bad metaphor between saying like, oh, these two things are next to each other. They must be in some kind of causal relationship. So that's if you hear my children yelling, they're watching television in the next room. So he says you see this even more clearly when you start talking about politics. And he says this on page, well, you don't have pages, but still in section 4. We don't have a clear idea of things like government, religion. These are great examples, right? Not controversial at all. But what we do is we do see that there are some people who seem to have power over other people, that the judge can fix by his opinion, a possession or property of anything betwixt any members of the society. So the judge's will says, okay, you owe this person money, or this person has to go to jail. And it's not causal in a sense, but we sort of picture the will as having that ability. Yep, you gotta go, babe. I'm recording. We use the image of the judge who does appear to have power as what I then ascribe to the causal relationship between the pen and the ink, the flame and the heat. I'm going to close the window, the door. I'll be right back. So, okay. So that, I hope that starts to make sense. Causation, cause and effect are a bad metaphor based on contiguity, just physically two things being next to each other, and resemblance. These things are a little bit like each other. The ink, the pen, like the tip of it looks black, so the black writing could be from it. Yeah, there's a lot going on in his political metaphor. I think he seems to be very suspicious of the judge's power. So if he's suspicious of the judge's ability to will property in and out of existence, it sort of makes sense why he'd be more suspicious on a metaphysical level as well. We can talk about that tomorrow as well. He says, nothing is more requisite, nothing's more required for a true philosopher than to restrain the intemperate desire of searching into causes. And having established any doctrine upon a sufficient number of experiments, he has to rest content with that. And when he sees a further examination that would lead him into obscure and uncertain speculations, he has to stop. So I really like that. That's really helpful for what we've been doing with Aristotle and the causes. If you have an intemperate desire for searching into causes, you have an immoderate desire. Your desire is too strong. He seems really suspicious, almost in a moral way, that if we're trying too hard to figure out what causes what, figure out where, I don't know, examples escape me without a classroom in front of me. But if we inquire too hard into like what the nature of the causes are, like we've been doing in Aristotle, we're almost being like foolish or immoral or kind of like, in Greek you would say heuristic, like we have too much of a faith in our own power. He's a Presbyterian. So, all right. The last two steps in this argument, I want to read to you the specific part where he talks about why there's no substance, or for our purposes, why there's no form in the Platonic or the Aristotelian sense. And then I also want to talk about why he believes there's no such thing as abstract ideas at all, none whatsoever. So that would mean there's no such thing as a human being or humanity as an idea, no such thing as the idea of a book, no such thing as the idea of justice, unfortunately, or the idea of good. And then finally talk about the place where he specifically talks about how you can't say that a cause has any real reality. So let's see. At the very beginning of section 6 of Modes and Substances, I'll just read to you from this paragraph. I would fain ask those philosophers who found so much of their reasonings on the distinction of substance and accident, and imagine we have clear ideas of each, whether the idea of substance be derived from the impressions of sensation or reflection. If it be conveyed to us by our senses, I ask, which of them and after what manner? If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be a color. If by the ears, a sound. If by the palate, a taste. And so of the other senses. But I believe none will assert that substance is either a color, or a sound, or a taste. The idea of substance must therefore be derived from an impression of a reflection, if it really exists. But the impressions of reflection resolve themselves into our passions and emotions, none of which can possibly represent a substance. We have, therefore, no idea of substance, distinct from that of a collection of particular qualities, nor have we any other meaning when we either talk or reason concerning it. So this is a great paragraph, and he's in all of section 6, which is very short. It's only 3 paragraphs. All of it talks about how, basically trying to say that like a classical Aristotelian way of thinking about form or Platonic way is just simply wrong. When I see like, let's see, what's a good thing? Where's a good cup? I don't think I have a cup in here. When I see the jar the candle jar. We have been talking as though a jar had a form, like the what it is to be of a jar, its jarriness. The quality, which I know, like, it's a container of a size, usually handheld. You can't, if it's too big, it's not going to be a jar. That's for the purposes of containing a small number of things. And a good jar is made of a substance that's strong enough to not melt or coming up with the substance of a jar here. It's like a kind of container, but not, it's not like Tupperware. We'll say that. Its essence is different from Tupperware. So, okay, but what Hume would say is that, okay, all that's nonsense. What I see is brown. I see that I've got some buttons in here. I see like a distinction between the bottom of the jar and the top. I feel its weight, so I know that it's kind of heavy. I'm judging that it's made of glass. There's no jarness of this, and there's no coherent way of explaining what the class of jars are, the class kind of what it means to be a jar. What this is just a bundle of impressions: brown, heavy, not conical. It's a cylinder. It's two cylinders set into each other. And then it's just from custom and habit, and remember contiguity, it's just from seeing all these things next to each other physically that my mind, through custom, through just a force of habit, enough experience in the world, calls it a jar. So that sounds like relatively uncontroversial, because I don't know how committed any of us are to like demanding that jars have an essence, although I personally, it's a good Aristotelian, would say that jars have some kind of form, and telos and all of it. But you see, like, if this is true of any kind of thing, it gets worse. If a human being is just a bundle of different characteristics, like they have a head, they have arms, they have feet, and the only reason why I would say that organism is a human being is because of force of having seen like thousands of human beings over the course of my life. There's no essence of humanity. There's no form of humanity. There's no fundamental underlying personality of humanity that that would cross over from one time period to the other. The idea of human is just a bundle of like ever-changing attributes. So again, that also is an argument I'm sure you've heard before, because a lot of Humean skepticism is something that's been really, really popular in the last 300 years or so. But the problem is, like, once you take it into an ethical realm or a political realm, or even just like a scientific realm, you really start to see problems. Like, if there's no human nature, then I can't predict human actions in any sort of meaningful way. And also, I might not have a responsibility or a duty to treat human beings a certain way, because the idea of human beings doesn't exist. So he's really building a lot, and like we lose a lot when we lose the idea of substance/form. So it's, however, again, still important to think like, and this is what I'm asking you guys to do for your reflection this week. Can you think yourself into a world imaginatively where there's no coherence to any object that you see, where the picture, the window, none of that has a meaning. It's just a bundle, like a little awkward bundle of sense impressions, and it doesn't have any meaning of itself. It's a little terrifying, but see if you can do it. All right, and the last two steps. Now I'm in section 7, called Of Abstract Ideas. And this is what follows from this basic distinction between impressions and ideas. He says, look, whenever I come up with a general idea, it is really in itself a definite thing. There's no such thing as an abstract idea. I use words like human or table or jar, cup, justice, to denote my specific memories of my experiences of things that I've associated with those terms. So there's no such thing as a human, but I just have enough of a memory of enough experiences of seeing things that I've heard other people call human, that I have an extremely rough and hazy idea from habit of some specific human once that I saw or am seeing now. And I'm saying that that's a general idea, but I am very mistaken. Human beings act as though we have general ideas, but in fact, if you examine our psychology, as he's trying to do, our human nature, hilariously, um, we don't have that capacity. We simply cannot think fully abstractly. So this is interesting, and we'll get to talk about this a fair amount when we get to Aristotle. Aristotle is a complicated answer to this question. He doesn't think that there are abstract ideas, and he doesn't think that we think without particular images, but he still obviously thinks that form has some kind of reality that's neither abstract nor particular. So Hume's really fudging a lot here, and you gotta wonder, like, he says no one's ever thought about this stuff before. To what extent did he I mean, everyone at this time period was like very eager to reject Aristotle. And I don't know how much he's doing this on purpose or just out of ignorance. Anyway, so if you can imagine that, the world in which all of these, like, there are no such things as abstract ideas, any at all. And he even goes so far as to say that this is true of mathematical things, which hurts the good Platonists in us all. Even our idea of a triangle isn't of the form of a triangle as a three-sided thing, a three-sided figure without depth or dimension, other than two dimensions. He says, yeah, no, that's just a collection of various triangles that you once kind of ran across. You can sort of see he's not a mathematician. So yeah, every general abstract noun that I use, cup, table, bench, window, even the word outside, all of that is just a hazy mishmash of impressions. And you can see, like, when people make that claim, it is hard to claim, like, okay, well, maybe this jarriness or human nature is like this mysterious ghost in the machine that I've just been confused about. Maybe it is actually good. Maybe skeptics are right. Form is sort of like a mysterious thing that doesn't seem to adhere in any one quality. And that's a good question to ask for Aristotle. Aristotle insists that there's a wholeness, particularly to natural kinds, particularly to the organism as such, that isn't necessarily present in any one definite quality, but seems to be part of like the whole totality of your experience of it, that you can experience through perception. He says you take in the form when you see something. It's simply a matter of how your senses work. All right, the very last part is in when we get to the big, like, volume, like, not stop volume. I might get this wrong. I have it written down. It's book 1, section 2, part 2 rather. Book 1, section 2, section 6. You can look this up if you're online. You can search for of the inference from the impression to the idea. So in this particular section 6, this is where he talks finally. The only things that are real are our impressions. Our ideas are just a mishmash of impressions. This is true of all form, and it's also going to be true of cause and effect. So form is a mysterious thing, and it is actually difficult to sort of understand what it would be or why it would have any sort of real reality in the world. But when you go attacking cause and effect, that's something that, even if you're like the strictest, most skeptical, reductive thinker in the world, it's actually kind of, it's dangerous to take away the idea that cause and effect would have a reality. He claims that there's no abstract ideas. That means that you would have to claim that the idea of cause at all, that anything has some kind of source or prior relationship to something else that put it into being. To claim that is to claim that none of our experiences of gravity or light, or the fact that fire burns you, or that, like, if I kick a chair, I'm going to stub my toe. That would mean that all of that is fake. So that's a lot. And again, I don't know enough about Hume to know like to what extent he means this in good faith, but he is constructing a fairly consistent, logically consistent system based on that initial distinction between impressions and ideas. So in this section 6 of the inference from the impression to the idea, he says, it is therefore by experience only that we can infer the existence of one object from that of another. So if I can get from one object to its cause. The nature of experience is this. We remember to have had frequent instances of the existence of one species of objects, and also remember that the individuals of another species of objects have always attended them, so have always been next to them, and have existed in a regular order of contiguity and succession with regard to them. Thus we remember to have seen that species of object we call flame, and to have felt that species of sensation we call heat. We likewise call to mind their constant conjunction in all past instances. Without any further ceremony, we call the one cause, the other effect, and infer the existence of the one from that of the other. In all those instances from which we learn the conjunction of particular causes and effects, both the causes and effects have been perceived by the senses and are remembered. But in all cases, wherein we reason concerning them, there is only one perceived or remembered, and the other is supplied in conformity to our past experience. So we see flame, we see a candle flame, and we saw the heat next to it, or we experienced the heat as an impression next to the candle flame. Do those have any relationship to each other? Do they have any real connection? Hume would say our thinking puts them together because they're physically next to each other. So that when later on I'm like naively thinking to myself, well, heat is like flame causes heat. I know that fire causes heat. He's like, no, you have a memory, the past sense impression based on the contiguity of those two things. And my imagination supplies that conjunction and calls it cause and effect. But that's all it is. Our minds are simply not powerful enough to truly, really understand the relationship between these things. So that's a huge claim, and that requires some sort of thought on your part to sort of go through, not just in the case of heat and flame, but like you kicking the chair or someone punching you in the face, just a contiguity of punch and pain. In the second one, we'll talk more about why he's doing this, and particularly the appendix is important, but I'll go ahead and pause that for now and talk to you guys live on Thursday.